I heard of a situation years ago when I was reading a book where there was a preacher who was talking about when he was younger and he had just became a Christian, and he prayed that God would give him a situation where he would be able to tell his story. And he was an athlete in college, and he ended up having a really good year, and he was going to be the college athlete of the year for that school. And because he had prayed for an opportunity to talk about Jesus, when he went up there to accept his award, he took that opportunity as a chance to talk about God. And I always, when I heard that story, I always thought to myself, if I had a situation where I was going to have to, tell people about God or tell people about my story or tell people something, what story would I tell? And that kind of leads us to our story today, because I always thought to myself, I'm going to find a way to turn this story into a good opportunity to tell people about God or the importance of God. And so just to recap, on August 27th, we talked about Ephesians 4:7, and that was God gives us gifts. And then last week, we talked about Jonah, and we talked about stop running and taking care of the things that are important to you. And so that leads us to today, September 10th, and what I have here is what happens when we don't care for the gifts that we have been given. And so when I think about somebody in the Bible who was given a gift and didn't take care of it, that kind of leads us to the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, we have the story of Samson. And that's the story of somebody who was given power and strength, and we're going to see how he used it. And so in Judges 13, 1 through 5, it says the birth of Samson. And so it starts off and it says, "Again the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for 40 years. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, 'Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden fruit. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to the Lord as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines.'" So, again, this is something that we learned in the book of Jeremiah, and I think it's so important to think about. But even before we were born, God had a plan for us. God knew that he was going to give us a gift of some kind, and that we were going to be able to use it. And in this situation, he is talking to this family, and he is telling them, "I'm going to give you a son, and this is what I want you to do, because I have plans for him." And so, just to recap here, it says that he was going to be born a Nazirite, and that's a man or a woman who has taken the Nazirite vow, which is distinguished by abstinence from certain actions. And the Nazirite vow in the Old Testament, it says the Hebrew term for Nazirite comes from the Hebrew word meaning to separate. And Numbers 6 presents the distinguished features of this vow as abstaining from anything related to grapes and or alcohol, refraining from cutting one's hair, and avoiding dead people, even family members. So that's kind of what it was. That's how he was going to be raised. Those are just some basic guidelines there. And so as we continue here, it says in Judges 13, verses 24 and 25, it says, "When her son was born, she named him Samson. And the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he lived in Mahanaim Dan, which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol." So here we have a situation where before he was even born, God said, "Hey, I'm going to use this child." And then as that child was growing up, God was creating a stir in him. And so he was saying, "Hey, I'm going to use you. I'm going to use you. Be prepared. Be prepared." And so if we continue here, this is a situation where I think, I like to use stories that we learned as children. And I think that Samson is one of those stories that we learned about when we were younger. And if we kind of think back to how we learned that, what happened is we learned that Samson was a man of great strength. And then he met this woman, and he told the secret, and people were working with that woman against Samson, and they took his strength away, and then he lost all of his power. And that's kind of the story that we learned as a child. And when you go back and you look at it as an adult, I find it to be so interesting, because there's almost a story before the story where Samson should have learned his lesson and he didn't learn it. And so in Judges 14, the title says Samson's Riddle. And it says, one day when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. When he returned home, he told his father and mother, a young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me. His father and mother objected. Isn't there even one woman in our tribe or among all the Israelites you could marry? They asked. Why must you go to the pagan Philistines to find a wife? So right away, even though this person was, designated before birth as somebody who was going to do something important, and even though, it's in Scripture that you shouldn't marry somebody from another place, and the Philistines were their enemy, he wanted to do it anyway. So he was being a little stubborn, we'll say. And so it says, but Samson told his father, get her for me, she looks good to me. His father and mother didn't realize the Lord was at work in this, creating an opportunity to work against the Philistines who ruled over Israel at that time. And I think this is so important, because as we look at this, sometimes we think, if a mistake has been made, then everything is done and over with and God can't use us anymore. But it's so important to sit there and realize that sometimes, even as we're making a mistake, God already has a plan of what he's going to do. And so here as we continue, it says, as Samson and his parents were going to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson near the vineyard of Timnah. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. He did it as easily as if it were a young goat, but he didn't tell his father or mother about it. When Samson arrived in Timnah, he talked with the woman and was very pleased with her. So we have a situation where he's walking along and a lion attacks him, and God gives him the strength to kill this lion. And for some reason he doesn't tell anybody. But again, he is recognizing the strength that he has. Not all of us have a story about, I was walking down the road and the lion attacked me and no big deal, but I just killed it and left it there. We don't have that story. So he had to know that he was separated from everybody else with his strength. And if we continue in verse 8, it says, later when he returned to Timnah for the wedding, he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion, and he found that a swarm of bees had made some honey in the carcass. He scooped up some of the honey into his hands and ate it along the way. He also gave some to his father and mother, and they ate it. But he didn't tell them he had taken the honey from the carcass of the lion. And so what we have here is a situation where he's walking along and he sees the destruction that he caused, and he also sees something interesting, that there's honey there, and so he decides to taste it. And I think as he's kind of walking along, he's thinking to himself how weird this situation is. And so if we continue, as his father was making the final arrangements for the marriage, Samson threw a party at Timnah, as was the custom with the elite young men. When the bride's parents saw him, they selected 30 young men from the town to be his companions. Samson said to them, let me tell you a riddle. If you solve my riddle during these 7 days of celebration, I will give you 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing. But if you can't solve it, then you must give me 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing. All right, they agreed. Let's hear your riddle. So he said, out of the one who eats came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And so as I read that, I'm thinking to myself, that must have been something that he thought of as he was eating that honey and walking along. He was thinking about the interesting situation and how unique it was, and he just came up with this riddle, and then now he has a situation where he can tell this riddle to someone. And so it says, 3 days later, they were still trying to figure it out. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to explain the riddle for us, or we will burn down your father's house with you in it. Did you invite us to this party just to make us poor? So here we have a situation where Samson doesn't realize it yet, but the person that he is, this is kind of the engagement engagement part of everything, but in biblical times, when you have that engagement, that's considered somebody that's already kind of promised to you, so they say wife in that situation. So they've come to her, they've threatened her family, and they've said, you need to tell us what this means. And it says, so Samson's wife came to him in tears and said, you don't love me, you hate me. You have given me a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. And his reply is, I haven't even given the answer to my father or mother. Why should I tell you? So she cried whenever she was with him and kept it up for the rest of the celebration. At last, on the seventh day, he told her the answer because she was tormenting him with her nagging. Then she explained the riddle to the young man. So what she found out was that if I go to him and I complain and complain and complain and complain, then he's going to tell me what I want to hear. And he was sick of hearing it. He didn't want to bother with it, so he told her. And so if we continue, it says, so before sunset on the seventh day, the men of the town came to Samson with their answer. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And then it says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who explained the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home, and Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who attended him at the feast. So we have a situation where he finally figures out what happened, and that his wife is the one that told them the answer. And so again, God blessed him with this great and powerful strength, and he went out and he attacked 30 of their own men and stole everything from them, and that's how he paid his debt. And so, of course, he was angry and mad, and so he went back home. And so we're going to kind of continue here. And if we go to Judges 16, now is the story that we all heard as children. And I think it's so important as we read this, in Judges chapter 16, we have to remember what just happened. And it says sometime later. Okay, so I don't know how much sometime later is, but if that situation had happened to me, I don't know that it matters how much time later it is. I'm going to remember what happened. Okay, most of us have a situation where we got our heart broke 20 years ago or something, and we still kind of remember it. So I believe that this was still fresh in his mind, but he decided it was time to move on. And so it says here in verse 4, it says, sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the valley of Sorek. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong, and how he can be overpowered and tied up securely. That each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So here Samson finds himself in pretty much the same situation. He found a woman that he wanted, and he didn't care the situation. He said, this is what I want. And so even though there may have been a situation where maybe it wasn't the best situation, he wanted to go. He was stubborn. And so he wanted to go ahead and do what he wanted to do. He wasn't going to listen to anybody else. And so he finds himself in this situation. And so in verse 6 it says, so Delilah said to Samson, please tell me what makes you so strong and what it would take to tie you up securely. Samson replied, if I were tied up with 7 new bowstrings that have not been dried, I would become as weak as anyone else. So that's the first situation where he told her an answer, and he found out that the Philistines were there and they were going to attack him. So he said the secret even though it was a lie, and then all of a sudden that situation happened. Then in verse 11 it says, Samson replied, if I were tied up with brand new ropes that had never been used, I would become as weak as anyone else. So now here's the second time where he said what would happen, and then it happened. So all of a sudden he has this situation from before where he told somebody a secret, and then they kind of threw it in his face, and he had to deal with everything. Now all of a sudden it happened again, and it happened again, and now in verse 13 it's going to happen again. So for the third time with Delilah it says, you've been making fun of me and telling me lies. Now tell me how you can be tied up securely. Samson replied, if you were to weave the 7 braids of my hair into the fabric on your loom and tighten it with the loom shuttle, I would become as weak as anyone else. Now, if there's anything I've learned, it's 3 strikes and you're out. This is the third time that he told her, and exactly right after, what happens here is this line that's at the bottom here. And it says, again she cried out, Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you. So each of these 3 times, he told her a lie about what was going to happen and that it would make him weak. And 3 times right after, he falls asleep and she screams out, the Philistines are magically somehow here and they've come to capture you, and he still has the strength to overtake them. So 3 times he does this. For most people, that would be enough for us to learn our lesson. But here we're dealing with a stubborn person. And it says, finally in verse 15, Delilah pouted, how can you tell me I love you when you don't share your secrets with me? You've made fun of me 3 times now, and you still haven't told me what makes you strong. She tormented him with her nagging day after day until he was sick to death of it. So here we have the same words that were used in the previous situation are used again here. And it says that he was sick of hearing her nag, and so he ends up telling the secret. And again, it's just somebody who's stubborn, who's not patient, who again, they want what they want. And so here in verse 17 it says, finally Samson shared his secret with her. My hair has never been cut, he confessed, for I was dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as anyone else. Delilah realized that he had finally told her the truth, so she sent for the Philistine rulers. Come back one more time, she said, for he has finally told me a secret. So the Philistine rulers returned with the money in their hands. So again, here's the situation, and as we're kind of going along here, in verse 14, chapter 14, 13 and 14, it's kind of said like the birth of Samson, and it's talked about how God was going to use him. And God did use him to kill some Philistines, but we haven't read anything about what he had this strength for. He hasn't really had a chance. He's killed the lion. He's attacked some men when he was mad. But that's really all he's used his strength for. And so, it says, Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap, and then she called in a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. In this way, she began to bring him down, and his strength left him. Then she cried out, Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you. When he woke up, he thought, I will do as before and shake myself free. But he didn't realize the Lord had left him. So those are the words that are used there. It didn't say anything about the strength. It said, but he didn't realize the Lord had left him. And so here's a situation where God had given him his strength. His gift that he had been given was his strength. And he wasn't using it for God. He was just kind of using it whenever it was convenient. And all of a sudden, when he realized that this gift wasn't there anymore, it didn't say the gift left him. It said that the Lord had left him. And I think that's so important to sit there and think about, is that we've all been given gifts. We've all been given something that God decided before we were even born, hey, this is what I'm going to give to this person. And we all have this gift available to us, but guess what? We're not using it. And I think it's so scary to sit there and think about how, when God gives you a gift, even if you don't make a conscious effort to sit there and use it on a daily basis or to use it for his power, you can still use it to your advantage. It's a gift from God. And so a lot of us kind of go about life and we're kind of using it, and even though we're not using it for God, we're still able to use it, and it's still working about 50%. If God gave you the gift of encouragement, you're still going out there and encouraging people. You're still going out there and being nice to people. If God gave you the ability to speak, you're still going out there and talking. If God gave you the ability to help others, you're still helping other people. So what we find here is that I believe Samson used his strength for certain things, but he wasn't necessarily using it for God. And that is my biggest fear when we talk about something like this and we talk about the gifts that God has given us. I never want us to be in the same situation as Samson. I never want us to be in a situation where God has given us a gift and we're not taking advantage of it. We're just kind of going throughout our daily life and we're just kind of, I can use it today to my advantage. It's good. It's convenient for me today, so I'm going to use this gift. I want us to be able to pray that we know what our gift is and that we know how to use it, and that every single day we find ways that we can use that gift to bring people to Christ. That's why he gave us that gift. And so if we continue here in verse 21, it says, "So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chains, and forced him to grind grain in the prison." And I think to myself, as he's in this situation, his eyes have now been gouged out. He has that moment of clarity that says, I had this strength and I didn't use it. And guess what? Now the time is up. I can't use it anymore. And so here it says Samson's final victory. And it says, the Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed so many of us is now in our power." Half drunk by now, the people demanded, "Bring out Samson so he can amuse us." So he was brought from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. So here he had this gift that God had given him. And again, we all have a gift that God has given us that he wants us to use. And here he is. He knows that, his life is coming to an end soon. And that's the thing that I want to kind of focus on today, right before we get to this final slide, is I never want any of us to be in that situation where our life is about ready to end and we realize we never used the gift that God gave us. That is one of my biggest fears, not only for myself, but everybody else, that we get to that point where our life is almost over and we have this big, huge regret that God gave us something that we were supposed to use and we didn't use it. So I encourage everyone, before we get to this final slide here for the day, I encourage all of us to really be thinking about how we can use the gift that God gave us and how we can use it starting today or this week. I don't want any of us to wait too long, because if we wait too long, we get to this last slide and we see what happens. And this last slide says, "Then Samson prayed to the Lord, 'Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes.' Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. Later, his brothers and other relatives went down to get his body. They took him back home and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, where his father Manoah was buried." And before we get to that last sentence, I just kind of want to go over what we read. And again, like I was talking about, it says, "Then Samson prayed, 'Remember me again.'" And so he knew that he hadn't used his gift that God had given him. And so he said, right before he dies, he said, "Just please, one more time. One more time, let me use the gift that you had given me." And that's what I was saying is I don't want people to be in that situation where, they're getting ready to die and they say, "God, just one more time, please let me use that gift." And if we look at this last sentence here, I always thought this was so interesting, because the last sentence of this says, Samson had judged Israel for 20 years. And I think to myself, we just started this chapter, or this story, and it said the birth of Samson. And never once did it talk about the way that he had judged Israel. There was no verses about, hey, he was judging Israel and this is a decision he made. It talked nothing about that. It just talked about how he wasted his gift. And I just think about that, and like I said, I pray to everyone that for everyone to be able to use that gift and not to abuse it. And that's what when I sit there and I think about it, he abused his gift. He didn't take advantage of it and use it. And again, we see how the story ends. The story ends with him just being in that situation where, he just wanted to use that gift one more time. And I don't ever want anyone to be in that situation. So So as we get ready to pray and have our final song, again, let's just think about how we can use the gift that God has given us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Please help us as we go throughout our day and our week. Please help us to just have clarification on what our gifts are and how you can use that gift in our life. Please help us not just to be content with the gift that you've given us. Just help us to use that gift to your glory. The gift that you have given us, you want us to use, and you want us to find ways that we can use that to help the people around us and to help more people come to you. Just please help us not to just be casual about our religion. Please help us not to be casual Christians who only worship on Sunday. Please help us to be the type of Christians that love you 24/7, 365. Please help us to know what to do and to always be praying to you on how we can do your will. In Jesus' name, amen.